morning. We're going to have kind of a fun hour here talking about horses. And I'm going to start with a little bit of horse history that not everybody's aware of. If the paleontologists are correct, the horse originated in North America around 55 million years ago. The first species of horse is what they call the dawn horse. From that, we had the development of many other horses over millions of years. Now, a very important point to make right here is the definition of a native animal. For an animal to be native, it has to meet two criteria. One criteria is that the animal has to evolve in its own ecosystem without the involvement of mankind. So horses have been on this planet for 50 million years plus. Man's been on this planet how long? And how long has man been in North America? 15 to 30,000 years maybe? So obviously horses are native by definition. Whether a horse was brought back to America at a later time does not make it a non-native species. Okay, it's still a native species because its origin is here in North America. And this is a very important thing because it's going to affect the way that the United States government looks at the horse. And if it's classified as native, it gets a much more respectful treatment than horses that are not classified as native. This is a very important thing for us. So over this time of involvement, we saw the modern horse genetics appear probably around 5 million years ago. Now, something else was taking place 5 million years ago, and that is North America and South America were being connected through a series of volcanoes that we call Central America. Sometime after the connection of North America to South America, we see horses moving down into South America. So we flash forward in time, and there's controversy right now on this, so I'm going to say at least 1 million years ago, we had our first land bridge connecting North America to Asia. And we saw that the horses went across the land bridge the wrong way and ended up in Asia, Europe, and Africa. This puts horses on 5 of the 7 continents. Only Antarctica and Australia didn't get horses. So this is kind of the quick movement of the horses. But what genetics has done, and what Laura's going to be talking about here in a few minutes, is we have a very fun thing. They now realize that the horses in Europe and Asia are genetically identical to the North American horses, meaning that the horses were crossing both directions across the land bridge for over 1 million years. Most of the time when I was in school, the land bridge only was supposed to have existed about 40,000 years ago. And that's completely changed now with the new knowledge. So I'm going to mention a second land bridge to you. And during this same ice age that created the land bridge between North America and Asia, it also created a land bridge between Europe and the British Isles. And horses migrated across that land bridge into what we now call Great Britain. And we have horses over there that are around 700,000 years old on the remains of the horses. So this is very, very strong evidence for the horses to go from North America across Asia, across Europe, and into Great Britain, and be there at around 700,000 years ago, that the horse had to have migrated much earlier. So this is kind of a fun thing for us. So then, again, back to about 5 million years ago, we see the development of what we call equus caballus. So I'm going to let Laura start talking about all these ancient breeds of horses and the relationship to Equus caballus.
Well, I want to first say, Dusty Pierce, thank you for introducing to me this fabulous rabbit hole, or in New Mexico we call it an arroyo. But anyway, it's a fascinating journey in learning about our current horse breeds of our Mustangs and how they are related to those ancient breeds. So just to follow along with what you were just saying, I'll go ahead and go with the ancient. And so the most interesting and ancient wild animal we all know is the Przewalski. And he is an Eohippus and probably mostly relates, according to regular and mainstream understanding, that he is a wild horse. He has about 66 chromosomes. And then your domestic horse, so to speak, Equus caballus, has 64. And so it's very interesting that the various species that Dusty was talking about, Equus lambi, or the Yukon horse, or the Equus scotti, or the donkey, the donkey has 62 chromosomes, but they have 64 chromosomes. But what is interesting is if you will take the wild animal, the Przewalski, and he will mate with Equus caballus, then you can come out with a fertile mare. And so it comes down to the point that it doesn't matter. A horse is a horse, of course. So if you can expand on that a little bit, or have anything.
Can I ask a question with that, though? You lost me. The Przewalski has 64?
66.
66. And the other horse that you were talking about breeding with has how many?
64. Equus caballus has 64.
Fertile offspring from those.
You can get a fertile offspring. Now, if the offspring turns out to have 65 chromosomes, then you will not have a fertile horse or a fertile mare. So the point here is that it's a horse, and they can breed, and they're indigenous to North America where they began.
Okay. A zebra can also breed with a horse. And a zebra has how many chromosomes?
A zebra has 32.
For some reason, I thought that was a limiting factor.
Yeah. Well, it would seem like it would be. Obviously, that's not the case. So, we have horses breeding with burros. We generally call them either a mule or a heaney. And sometimes they are fertile. So we have a lot of evidence now that these ancient horses are Equus caballus, and no different in Europe, Asia, Africa, North America, and South America. And something you do not hear very much about is the South American horses. Now, one of the fun things, only for about the last 35 years have they really had, microbiology where they're capable of studying things like horse DNA. And most all of us remember when they first completely translated the human genome. Well, now they've done that with horses. And right now, you can breed horses for color, shape, conformation, athleticism, and you can work with different companies. One of the ones we work with is in Florida, Edelon.
Edelon is in California, yeah,
California.
and Texas A&M. But the interesting thing about that is the chromosomes, and then what he's talking about is genetics, is you'll have, your chromosomes, but it's your genetics that attach to those chromosomes that will get you your colors and your differentiations and your different traits. So you can have a large horse or a small horse. Go ahead.
So is it the difference in the number of chromosomes that determines whether or not we'll have fertile offspring? So, for example, we know that usually a donkey horse hybrid is going to be infertile as a general rule. But is that because they have different numbers of chromosomes?
I'll take a stab at that, and I'm not a real expert on chromosomes, but what I have found in the research is that it depends on the number of chromosomes that is the result of that mating. So again, if a Przewalski wild horse mates with Equus caballus, then and has 66, and the result is 66 chromosomes, then you will have a fertile mare. If it's 65, if the result is 65 chromosomes, then you will not have a fertile offspring.
And I've heard that, like, if you breed that basically the plains zebra, there's 3 subspecies of zebra. If you, that basically the plains zebra is more closely related to the horse, the modern horse, than it is to the Grevy zebra, which is considered the most primitive form of equid. And so this stuff is really interesting.
And then
I love this kind of stuff. It's just understanding it is so interesting.
And then that goes to the mountain zebra. And then here's another point that I'm going to take it to other species that might be relevant in our understanding how these horses, Equus caballus, Przewalski, are all the same and indigenous to our area. If you look at the sage grouse, or you look at the suckerfish, as you were just saying, you might have several different species. So if you've got the zebra with the grays and the mountain, and then in the sage grouse, you have the greater or the Gunnison sage grouse, or if you are a suckerfish, you have probably 79 species. And all of those species are considered indigenous and protected wildlife. So it all, just goes to the relevance of a horse is a horse, of course. And anyway, I would like to, not dominate. So is there anything else you want to add before I go from the Hickorea backwards?
Okay, well, we have a lot of information to share with you and not a lot of time to do it. So what we're going to try to do is just talk in generalities and allow you to ask a few questions if you have them. When we see the 1500s, Columbus's second voyage, he brought horses over to the New World. They were isolated on the island Hispaniola to begin with, but eventually moved into the mainland, and it was so expensive and so difficult to transport horses across the ocean in wooden ships, and they had a very high mortality rate. So these are things that people don't realize. One of the things that's kind of interesting, in the early transport of horses, the conquistadors rode stallions. So they might across the ocean, they might ship 100 head of stallions and maybe no mares at all. So when they start talking about this, of course it takes both mares and stallions. But we see very early dates on the explosion of horses in South, Central, and North America. And a lot of these dates predate events that we think was the start of the horse being introduced. So commonly, the Pueblo Revolt of 1690, we know that the Indians captured at least 1,200 horses in that Pueblo Revolt. So most of the time, the historians will acknowledge that's probably when horses, started going around to the American Indians. But we have an account that goes back 40 years before this. And this account is written down in history by at that time, the governor of New Mexico. And his cavalry had a mounted battle with Ute Indians. The Utes were horseback, and they fought with the Spanish cavalry. And this took place in 1639. And the Spanish, of course, with superior weaponry, won the battle, and they were able to capture both horses and capture a lot of the Ute Indians. Now, interestingly enough, the Ute Indians were already horse people, so what did the Spanish do after they enslaved them? They put them in charge of their horses, because they knew how to care for horses already. 2 years later, the Utes disappeared during the night with 200 head of Spanish horses. Now that's left out of most of the history books, but this is showing that the Indians had horses before the Spanish introduction. So this is part of what's kind of fun when we start really studying this. So we go down into South America and we follow the breeds of horses. Now, this is a Mustang summit, and we have Mustangs that are brought in from different pieces of land where they are running. Laura has a Mustang that came off of the Caracas Mesa in southern New Mexico. So she's going to talk a little bit about what she found with the genetics of her Mustang called Rambo.
Well, again, Dusty, thank you for the rabbit hole he has sent me into. And of course, in New Mexico, I said before, we call those arroyos. So what happened, Dusty Pierce and an individual by the name of Bob Browning of our area in Farmington, New Mexico, introduced me to Dan Elkins. And he was a pioneer in his time, started in 2004. And he began the age-old humane way of bait trapping. And also in that process, he began the fertility control darting of our horses in that local area, and worked closely with Dr. J. Kirkpatrick, who I got to become friends with. And so I find that as an honor. But that all led to what? I adopted a Mustang. And his name was already Rambo. He was a sales authority. He had been third strike. That means that if you're a Mustang and you're over 10 years old, or you've been returned 3 times, then you become a sales authority Mustang and worth $25 and sold. So anyway, the first thing I set about doing is I sent his DNA into Dr. Gus Cothran of Texas A&M. And when I got back the results, his first marker was the Galaseño, and that is indicative of the Garanos of the northern part of Spain. And so that was fascinating to me. And so I developed a friendship with Dr. Gus Cothran, and he also explained to me about a lot of the Iberian horses, our Mustangs, will have the pony draft and the regular draft. So I found that Rambo had in him the cream draft. And that was a conundrum for us because the cream draft was not invented or did not get bred until the 19th century in Ohio. So how did I have this rare cream draft genetic in Rambo? And the answer came to me when I finally got also to get the genetics off a famous and now celebrity horse of Etalon named Cabresto by me. And so I sent his DNA in, and when he died, he was in the Cabresto Canyon for 30 years. And lo and behold, he had the very same exact breed markers as Rambo. Rambo is now 15, Cabresto's 30, Rambo's from 27 miles up to the Caracas Mesa, Cabresto was in the canyon, and here these two had the same DNA. It even became more interesting to me because his draft, in him was the Belgium draft. And so now I had a question to answer. And so through study and discussion with a friend of mine by the name of Sarah Annan, explained to me that your rare cream draft is really genetically bred through the Belgium draft of France. So then I took my information and I compared it to a study that Dr. Gus Cothran did in 2013. And that genetic test also verified that our horses of the Jicarilla, where Rambo and Cabresto are from that alpine area of Spain, the Portugal, your areas of France, Italy, the Lusitanos. And so anyway, in this discovery, we found that it is true what Dusty Pierce has just said, that where a horse is originated or is it able to co-evolve decides if it's a indigenous species. So I'll take you back now to the Alps. So that area where these horses from the Jicarilla Ranger District, where Rambo and Cabresto are from that area. Well, our area also has that habitat of real cold alpine winters and then hot summers. And so these horses cohabitated, came to our area in New Mexico, and exist just like they had never left North America. So it is really incredible. I'm going to include one more point that I think is very important. The conformation of these horses are probably most likely those horses that can fit the conquistador male armor. And they call these horses square horses. And the square horse, like Rambo, they have the exact dimensions. So if you take Rambo, he'll be 14 hands across and up and down. And then you know that he's a Galiceño, but you really look at him and you discover that Rambo's, his facial features are a little bit not narrow enough to be Galiceño. And then if you measure the space between his ears, it's 3 inches. And so if you take those dimensions of Rambo and take the armor of the conquistador that, now is in the Albuquerque Museum, you would see that my Mustang Rambo with the square horse build is more likely to fit into the conquistador armor. So I hope I've taken you into that area, and then when you're ready, I can take Rambo and Cabresto back to Mongolia and back across the Bering Straits.
Okay. Sarah Annan is a terrific researcher, and she has websites with all kinds of information on what they call the square horse. And this all came about with a donation to the Albuquerque Museum of Spanish armor, actual Spanish armor. And they had human armor and the dog armor also, because the Spanish used dogs for attacking also. So when the museum wanted to display the armor, they went out and got a classic quarter horse conformation, plastic quarter horse that you see. The armor didn't fit it. So they started trying other breeds, and they couldn't get the armor to fit anything. So that's when they contacted Sarah Annan, and she started the process of doing all the measurements and proved that the conquistador square horse is what the armor was designed for. And that's the horses that are running around up on Caracas. So one of the things that surprised us when we got the DNA is we didn't see quarter horse, we didn't see thoroughbred, we didn't see Arabian, we didn't see all of these markers from the modern horses. This herd has survived as a true Spanish horse. So in Spain, they don't have true Spanish horses because they've been introducing all kinds of different breeds into their bloodlines. So Caracas is one of the places, and there's some other places around the United States where we find this Spanish horse DNA, as well as in Central and South America. So this is something that has taken us by surprise, and we've learned a lot in the process of going through all of this. So do you have anything to add to that?
I do. I'll just take us, you took us across the Bering Straits to Asia. I'll see if I can take us back. And anything you'll have to add to that, then we can, and we'll see where we go from there. So you take Cabresto and you take Rambo, and you go back up to Portugal or to the Guarano. And then let's learn our Spain history and know that it was not always Spain. Let's say, in 700 it was invaded, and it was invaded by a lot of history will say, because it's the Arabian and the say it real quick, the Arabian and the Berber type horse, and a little bit of blend of those Turkoman, were the same horses that the mercenaries rode in their invasion of Spain in 700. And so then you fast forward all of those years from 700 to 1492, then you have developed the horse that has ended up in, our New Mexico and our Mustangs today. But if I go back further, we can go to the Mongolia, where there's Przewalski, 6,000 years, where our first horses were said to be domesticated just by bit wear. Before that, they were domesticated through using them as milk and as food. And then you have your Russian Tarpans, and they say those are horses. They have 14 chromosomes, but they're more dog-like. And then we go back to Alaska and the Yukon horse, and then that's where we start getting into Equus caballus and the 66 chromosomes. Then to the Equus lambi, and our recent discovered by the inventor, or the one that discovered them, Equus scotti. And so anyway, I did make a movie, and in my movie, I like to say I have proven that a horse is a horse, of course. And my discovery was the famous bamboo harvester, caballus, otherwise known as Mr. Ed. I don't care if you're talking horse. Equus caballus is a horse, of course. And so anyway, I end with that. And then I also end with my great tribute to Les Hilton, who is the trainer of Mr. Ed. And he would be what we would be nature's natural, a type of man that would train a horse in the most gentle and kindest way in a time in 1950s when that was not popular.
Okay, now I'm going to take you through a little bit different genetic marker, and we're going to talk some colors. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the Appaloosa horse. So history generally teaches that the Appaloosa horse was created by the Nez Perce Indians up in the Pacific Northwest. And of course, that's what I learned when I was in school. The question was, is most of the Spanish horses brought into North America and South America was solid colored. Okay, a Spanish warrior would never ride a colored horse. Okay, they had to be all solid colored horses. So this led us to some real questions about the genetics on it. And interestingly enough, Dr. Cochran was over in Mongolia studying the Appaloosa horses of Mongolia and tied them directly to the American Appaloosa. So we see that we have a color marker from these horses coming from Mongolia across the land bridge into North America. And then we also find this color marker going all the way through the Spanish bloodlines and coming in across the Atlantic Ocean and into South America and eventually evolving. But when they started comparing the Spanish Appaloosa colors with the Mongolian Appaloosa colors with the Nez Perce Appaloosa colors, all the same. So these horses were world travelers. So this is one of the many things that we're starting to discover. And we've really seen an explosion of information in really the last about 3 years. So the next subject I would like to go into is, did the horse go extinct at the last ice age, as we were all taught when we were in school? Okay, during the glacial maximum, we were taught that all of the megafauna went extinct. The mastodons, the saber-toothed, the cave bears, horses, all of that. And they were reintroduced by the Spanish in the 1500s. Or as I prefer to say, they were brought home by the Spanish in the 1500s. So is that true? Well, for me, being, a cowboy, a horse would travel 20 miles for a drink of water. So the concept that the horse couldn't migrate faster than the ice sheets were building up in Canada was absurd to me. And, we've already seen where the horse had migrated all the way down into South America. So during the Ice Age, we had the ice sheet coming down to about the Canadian border, with exceptions. And we had in South America the ice sheet coming up from the south, which is something you very rarely hear people talk about. The Ice Age affected both poles, okay? But that still leaves a lot of land in between. So this is where it was very logical to me that they would find horses. So I started looking for information on this and found approximately 56 horse bones that have been dug up primarily in North America in the last probably 75 years, 100 years. Okay. On these horse bones, a lot of them date after the supposed extinction of 12,000 years ago. So we started seeing more and more studies on this. So I'm going to talk about one that is near and dear to us because it's in our neighborhood. And this is Navajo Lake. It's on the border of Colorado and New Mexico. And before they could flood Navajo Lake, they did their typical archaeological survey. Well, this is Anasazi country. So there were thousands of Anasazi sites going from basket weavers forward to the Pueblo builders down there. And at the confluence of the Piedra River and the San Juan River, which is very close to where I live, and by the way, very close to Caracas Mesa, there were two big Anasazi ruins. They're now underwater. So when they were digging down, the archaeologists study based on context. And context is they find pottery, and this helps them to date how old this particular dig is. And rule of thumb is the deeper you dig, the further back in time you go when you're in an Indian ruin. So they were digging down, and they were in the context of around the year 1100, which would be consistent with the Anasazi. And they started finding horse bones. So this is impossible. There weren't horses here, 400 years before Columbus. So they had to prove it. So they did C14 testing. The testing of these horse bones came back at the year 1100 plus or minus. So this is one of many sites where science has found horses. Now, this is very important that you understand this. Okay, the horse is capable of breeding, creating a generation in about a 5-year period of time. So we'll just use 5 years as an average. So if we go 10,000 years back in time, okay, and we divide that by 5, we have 2,000 generations of horses. So if we go backwards in time from one horse, okay, he had 2 parents, they had 4 parents. Exponentially, we have 1 million horses in only 20 generations. We're talking about 2,000 generations of horses. So there had to be far more horses to get to this one horse in this Anasazi ruin under Navajo Lake. So when you start researching this information, it exists. It's in museums. Okay, it's not usually published, but we're starting to see something very exciting happening. Is we have a new bunch of paleontologists. And these new paleontologists, among them, we have a lot of Native Americans. Those Native Americans grew up with the oral history that they always had horses. So they're open-minded to this. So they are starting to look for this. And they don't have to go any further than to go into the basement of the museum and pull up some of the horse bones and start testing them. So what they're finding is that the Plains Indians had horses further back in time than what we originally thought. before the Spanish horse could migrate up there. So we have a site down in Old Mexico in which it was basically a water hole. And they have been studying that water hole, and they've started finding mastodon bones. And then they started finding horse bones, and they started dating all of these horse bones coming forward. And they have horse bones almost up to the time of Columbus and just after Columbus, so 1492. So this one site shows that we have all of these horses coming up. What kind of horse bones were they digging up? Equus mexicanus, which is a modern cavalry horse. So we have probably 200 horses, or parts of horses, I should say, that have been found showing that the horse never went extinct in North, Central, and South America. So I have a saying that you don't get your PhD proving your professor wrong. Okay, you get your PhD by parroting your professor. So it's slow to change something that's been taught for over 100 years. But we have this young generation of open-minded paleontologists, and I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of this information coming to the surface because it exists. We have quite a few in Canada. Now, have any of you ever heard of the fawn map? This is a map that it was done by Illinois State University, and they track every ancient animal that's ever been found in North America. And they keep a map of location, information, all about it. And if you go to the fawn map and you start looking up equus that has been carbon-14 test dated, you start finding all kinds of equus bones that have been found in North America that date in that supposed extinction time between 12,000 years ago and 1500. So it's really exciting because now the argument completely goes away that horses are not native to this North American continent. So I think that's part of the fun of the research that we're doing.
So I believe it was Lewis and Clark who said that they estimated that there were between 2 and 7 million horses in the portion of North America that they traversed. And I've always thought it would be interesting to sort of do the math and figure out how, especially if you go toward the higher end, towards like 7 million, how many years would it take to get from the relatively small number of horses that were brought by the Spanish? Is that even mathematically possible? Mm-hmm. Or is there something else going on? So.
Yeah, and also you're talking about the Pacific Northwest, the furthest place you can be from the Spanish horse.
Right.
Okay, so that's a very valid point and a very interesting question. Interestingly enough, Lewis and Clark, their expedition was literally starving to death. So they survived, unfortunately, by eating horses. They ultimately were rescued by the Nez Perce Indians. Okay. And the Nez Perce took them in, being very friendly, and helped them out. And when the Nez Perce saw that Lewis and Clark were killing and eating horses, the Nez Perce thought that was the most disgusting thing they'd ever seen. That was such a barbaric act, they couldn't stand it. So they tried to distance themselves from Lewis and Clark because they killed and ate horses. So we have historical accounts of the first people sailing up the west coast of the United States, getting up into the area of Washington and Oregon, and looking ashore and seeing herds of horses. Okay, we have accounts written by the Chinese, and we know that the Chinese colonized North and South America starting about 4,200 years ago, and traveling across. One of the more recent people that came from China to North America was Marco Polo. And it's in his journals that he sailed with the Chinese to North America. And so that was missed in my history book when I was studying Marco Polo. So this is kind of a fun thing that we have all of this information. We had early Spanish conquistadors in South America, okay, running across herds of horses roaming free in South America, okay, with no explanation where these horses came from, but it's in the Spanish journals. So I think that if we can ever get a really detailed study done, there's going to be so much evidence, it's going to completely rewrite the history books as we currently have them. And for me, it's fun to be involved in history. It's more fun to rewrite history.
It's fun to also look at inaccuracies to learn. And so I love the story about Marco Polo. That's one of my favorite because he came to California to find the gold. And then the Spanish were looking for it in Kansas. I mean, I'm not, discounting anybody, but it was funny how the stories kind of unfold. And one of my favorite stories is, and let's go back to the ancient times, is about the Caspian horses. And of course, they're thought to be one of the most ancient horses ever, 3000 BC. And so, they were thought to have, and there was a rumor, or, it was a fact, they thought, that they became extinct in 1300. And then they all of a sudden realized in 1965, the Caspian was alive and well. And so those are the kind of things that you look and you just say, you do some deduction and do your research, and you will find how absurd it is to imagine that Equus caballus is not a horse that originated in North America.
Any questions?
Any questions?
We accept speculation too.
I have way too many questions to even know where to start, but I just think this is really fascinating, and I think it is also so valuable, this information that you're sharing, because it really, hopefully, will become infused in the campaign to save the American wild horse, and getting people. We are up against this narrative that horses are invasive, and that they're non-native, and that they're not indigenous, and it's been a real uphill climb to try and make inroads in disrupting that narrative. So.
Thank you. You brought up a very good point that I probably should elaborate on. We have a lot of isolated herds of Mustangs throughout the western United States and even some back east, okay, up in Canada, okay, down in South and Central America, even in Europe. And a lot of these horses, when they get in there and study the DNA, they're finding out that they are essentially their own breed. Dr. Cochran said that the Caracas Mesa Mustangs are essentially their own breed because they have been isolated for a long enough period of time. Another interesting point, very, very rarely with Mustangs do we see the problems of close breeding or inbreeding that we are seeing with a lot of the modern breeds of horses. Mm-hmm. Okay, and this is really kind of fascinating. Now, when I was young, I didn't quite understand the difference between close breeding and inbreeding, so I asked my father, what's the difference between close breeding and inbreeding? And he says, if it's successful, it's close breeding. If it's not successful, it's inbreeding. And that was his answer. I never forgot that. So, but we see that with cattle. You have a bull and a herd of cows, and your bulls are, breeding daughters and granddaughters and stuff like this. We're having the same problem with horses. So we have a genetic problem with a particular breed of horse, and that genetic problem is now getting bred into more and more and more of that particular breed. whereas we tend not to see this in the Mustang herds,
And
which is fascinating.
With that, Dr. Gus Cothran points out that that's, one very important reason why the Mustang must be protected, because it is them, it's that breed, it's their diversity that can be bred back into some of these breeds that Dusty was talking about to repair, their diversity.
So one herd in particular that I've always been very fascinated by is the Kiger herd in eastern Oregon. And these are horses where they are all done, or some variation of done. Many of them have the dorsal stripe and the zebra stripes. And so you often hear, and I know the federal government is often heard to say that these are the most primitive of all the wild horse herds. And I've heard some people say that, their lineage can go back to the very first Spanish horses, but I've heard others say that actually no, given these primitive characteristics, they actually go back to even before, the very first, the most ancient types of horses. Do you guys have any thoughts on the Kigers?
Yeah, if you take a look at an image, that they create of, say, an Equus, okay, it's almost always shown exactly the way you just described those horses. And that's part of the belief that these horses are very ancient in the genetics. Now, one of the things that exists is markers, okay? And they use these markers to try to identify some of these different horses. So down near Albuquerque, we have a string of pueblos along there. And a few years back, they dug up some horses, okay? These horses possessed unidentified markers in their DNA. So they had enough collagen that they could actually recover, very viable DNA from these horses. And they were finding unidentified markers. So that means that these markers go way back in time. So this looks like it's possible that some of these Pueblo Indians actually had horses before the Spanish came. So this is part of this ongoing study. And I've been collecting this information for years, but don't really have the time and the money to really pursue it the way that it needs to be pursued. And I would love to see a television miniseries dedicated to this, where you could travel literally all over the world and pull all of this information together and see what it yields for
I
us.
think that'd be great.
And that really brings up the point you just made, is that there are so many special herds that are special in and of themselves, like you're talking about the Geiger, or if you're talking about the Jicarilla herd, they'll probably be most closely related to your conquistador square horse. And so that's why it's so important that all of these different horse herds, or these Mustang herds, be protected. Yes.
We have a family of horses that were transferred to us by the Park Service. They were from the Mesa Verde National Park. And they all have that sort of primitive coloring. Actually, there's one of the mares had a bay colt, and then one of the mares is almost all black, but the rest of them are that dun, or buckskin color. And, I've heard that the Mesa Verde horses have been isolated, so it would be interesting to know if they've been close bred or interbred, but they are also the wildest horses on the Wild Horse Refuge. They are absolutely wild. And I mean, they are so, which is interesting because, there's quite a few people that go to the Mesa Verde National Park. You would think that they would be habituated to people and but these horses are want absolutely as far away from people as they can get. That's very interesting, how this one population of horses kind of has some of these extra wild characteristics.
Laura's an expert on the Mesa Verde herd, so we'll let her talk about it.
I don't know if I'm exactly the expert on the Mesa Verde
you
herd.
need to come up and meet this
Well,
herd.
Because the Four Corners were all so close, living in Dolores and also in Farmington. So then I have this wonderful opportunity to have that experience with the Mesa Verde herd and the Jicarilla, and then all of those reservation horses on the Ute. But we're finding, when we rescue them at the Four Corners Equine Rescue and do DNA testing, that we're finding some really interesting Iberian backgrounds. The Mesa Verde, also, we have those Perlinos that, with those blue-eyed Perlinos that are so incredibly outstanding. One of the issues, though, is that Mesa Verde is a rugged country, and so if they remove those horses, you'll take 40 horses off through bait and trap, you'll have then the rest replace them from the Ute tribe and the next door Navajo tribe. So anyway, it's all very interesting. I think it's so important that we look at genetics and the archaeological ways, but we also look at the history, the oral histories, and then do these deductions that we talked about today to make the inferences that our horses are indigenous to North America. Yeah. I have one story about the Mesa Verde, though, and then we'll answer your question. And that story is, I have a great cousin that took 150 of the Mesa Verde horses and herded them down to Pueblo Pintado. And that Pueblo Pintado is where Chaco Canyon is. And so those horses are right in line with our Jicarilla herd. So the Mesa Verde, even Mesa Verde's an hour and a half away from Farmington, New Mexico. You'll see that we have now Mesa Verde horses in our Jicarilla herd. So those stories, those history stories, those oral history stories tell us a lot about who our horses are in these different Mustang herds.
Question?
Well, for the history too, it's really interesting that if, our horses were here so early on, maybe they were more isolated in certain areas because, of course, they weren't really introduced to the Ute tribes here until quite later on. And then, of course, it really changed their lifestyles once the horse was introduced. So it's interesting that maybe the horses hadn't been kind of spread out through all areas. Maybe they had been in some more certain
And isolated.
Yeah.
Well, for sure, for the Jicarilla herd and Dr. Cothran's results, in that 2013, it took us about a year to get our hands on it. But if you look at all of the DNA they did on 40 horses, it did show they were isolated and became their own unique herd and bands. And then you see the resemblance when I compare Rambo and the band he came from in the Caracas with the Cabresto Canyon Cabresto horse. So.
We're running out of time, so you can catch either one of us after this and ask questions. We have tons of information. I have thousands of pages of information about different things around the United States. And you talk a lot about isolated horses. I can tell you they were not isolated. They were everywhere.
Wow.
Okay.
So why do you suppose it would have taken so long for some of the native people to be able to, incorporate the horses into their lives?
I don't know the exact answer to that. I will say this. In the early days, they identified horses based on morphology. And a lot of times they'd find a tooth, and they were trying to construct an entire horse from a single tooth. That's pretty tough to do.
Right.
Okay, so they would find parts of horses. Once in a while they'd get lucky and find a more complete skeleton. But they would tend to name those horses after themselves. So, somebody named Scotty found Equus Scotty. Okay, so this is kind of the way that it worked. But now with the micro part of this and the DNA, we can go back and take a closer look if we have viable collagen in those bones. And in the last 3 years, they're able to extract information with far less viable collagen than just a few years ago. It's just amazing how far they've come in this research. And that's what's really caused this understanding of horses to explode. Well, we're talking about East Coast, West Coast, Canada, all the way down to the southern tip of South America. Horses were everywhere.
So I'll make a conclusion. So when I say the bamboo harvester, can I say that's my horse? That's really the name of Mr. Ed.
That's his real name?
That's his real name. So if you didn't know that, now you do.
Thank you very much.
Was he used for harvesting bamboo, or what's the story there?
Well, his story, his owner was Les Hilton, and he was a very kind, gentle trainer. And then the horse that sometimes was a substitute for Mr. Ed, her name was Pumpkin. So we might as well put my name on them.
Yeah.
Because they're really no different than E. Comforcitas, the Yukon horse, the Scotty, the Equus Lambie, the Yukon horse. A horse is a horse, of course, and they originated in North America. And we better conclude with that because someone else needs to come on the set. Thank you so much.
If we can implement solutions that we know work, they have great value. And the time is now.
Bob and Dan hoped the bait and trap method would replace the need for helicopters to trap Mustangs and preserve their existence in the wild. It is along the sandstone and rimrock of the Caracas Mesa that Rambo and I share childhood memories. With 3 strikes against him, Rambo now faced entering a pipeline to slaughter. A treasure to me. I bought him.
My dad had a very special place in his heart, in his mind for horses.
What was Rambo's story? Why did I feel such a deep connection with him?
Rambo does, in fact, have relationship to an Iberian type breed, the Gallicino.
His Galliceño bloodline links his origins to the northwestern province of Galicia, of Iberian Celtic Spain. The dawn of Rambo began a long time ago.